Welcome to A Setting of Silver. This podcast exists to make historic Christian writings accessible to 21st century listeners. While not as valuable as the Bible, we can still learn much from the faith and practice of those who followed in the footsteps of the apostles. It's my hope that wherever you find yourself, these words, carried through time, would encourage you to walk in faith with Jesus. Lucius Caelius Firmianus Lactantius, better known just as Lactantius, was likely born sometime around AD 260 in North Africa. He was skilled in rhetoric and became a student of Arnobius, who himself taught in Sicca Veneria. Lactantius became so well known for his oratory skill that the Emperor Diocletian offered him a position in Nicomedia. Lactantius embraced Christianity and chose to resign his position before Diocletian's persecution. He lived in poverty until Constantine appointed Lactantius as tutor of his son around 315, and he died about 10 years later. Lactantius's greatest work is the Divine Institutes, which was likely composed sometime between 303 and 311. It consists of 7 books and a summary addressed to Pentadius. Through this work, Lactantius presents Christianity to a cultured, Latin-speaking audience in a polished, coherent, and well-written form. He begins the journey by refuting the philosophical and religious systems of the world, paving the way for discussions of true religion, wisdom, justice and worship, ending with a description of the best way to live life. Throughout the work, Lactantius draws upon his oratory experience and demonstrates a deep familiarity with Latin writings and pagan myths. In light of this, and in keeping with some authors of this early period, he frames Christianity in terms of the Greco-Roman conception of virtue. Lactantius, like Clement of Alexandria before him, identifies Christianity as true philosophy and the fulfillment of everything philosophers sought through human means. In casting Christianity in this light, however, Lactantius appears to suggest that we are saved through following Christ's commands and being sanctified by participating in the life of the Church, ultimately becoming perfect through obedience. This characterization is somewhat at odds with the fact that we are justified only by the blood of Christ. While our response to this salvation is obedience and a life of virtue, these actions do not, in themselves, allow us to enter the presence of God. As a result, I choose to read Lactantius the same way I read C.S. Lewis, not as a theologian but as an excellent communicator who faithfully sought to articulate his beliefs to the world. And now, please enjoy Book 7 of Lactantius's Divine Institutes.
It is well. The foundations are laid, as the illustrious orator says. But we have not only laid the foundations, which might be firm and suitable for the support of the work, but we have raised the entire edifice with great and strong buildings, almost to the summit. There remains a matter which is much easier, either to cover or adorn it, without which, however, the former works are both useless and displeasing. For of what avail is it, either to be freed from false religions or to understand the true one? Of what avail, either to see the vanity of false wisdom, or to know what is true? Of what avail is it, I say, to defend that heavenly justice? Of what avail to hold the worship of God with great difficulties, which is the greatest virtue, unless the divine reward of everlasting blessedness attends it? Of which subject we must speak in this book, lest all that is gone before should appear vain and unprofitable, if we should leave this, on account of which they were undertaken, in uncertainty, lest anyone should by chance think that such great labors are undertaken in vain, while he distrusts their heavenly reward, which God has appointed for him who shall have despised the present sweet enjoyments of earth in comparison of solitary and unrewarded virtue. Let us satisfy this part of our subject also, both by the testimonies of the sacred writings and also by probable arguments, that it may be equally manifest that future things are to be preferred to those which are present, heavenly things to earthly, and eternal things to those which are temporal. Since the rewards of vices are temporal, those of virtues are eternal. I will therefore set forth the system of the world, that it may easily be understood both when and how it was made by God, which Plato, who discoursed about the making of the world, could neither know nor explain, inasmuch as he was ignorant of the heavenly mystery, which is not learned except by the teaching of prophets and God, and therefore he said that it was created for eternity. Whereas the case is far different, since whatever is of a solid and heavy body, as it received a beginning at some time, so it must needs have an end. For Aristotle, when he did not see how so great a magnitude of things could perish, and wished to escape this objection, said that the world always had existed, and always would exist. He did not at all see, that whatever material thing exists must at some time have had a beginning, and that nothing can exist at all unless it had a beginning. For when we see that earth, and water, and fire perish, are consumed, and extinguished, which are clearly parts of the world, it is understood that that is altogether mortal, the members of which are mortal. Thus it comes to pass, that whatever is liable to destruction must have been produced. But everything which comes within the sight of the eyes must of necessity be material, and capable of dissolution. Therefore Epicurus alone, following the authority of Democritus, spoke truly in this matter, who said that it had a beginning at some time, and that it would at some time perish. Nor, however, was he able to assign any reason, either through what causes or at what time this work of such magnitude should be destroyed. But since God has revealed this to us, and we do not arrive at it by conjectures, but by instruction from heaven, we will carefully teach it, that it may at length be evident to those who are desirous of the truth, that the philosophers did not see nor comprehend the truth, but that they had so slight a knowledge of it, that they by no means perceived from what source that fragrance of wisdom, which was so pleasant and agreeable, breathed upon them. In the meantime, I think it necessary to admonish those who are about to read this, that depraved and vicious minds, since the acuteness of their mind is blunted by earthly passions, which weigh down all the perceptions and render them weak, will either altogether fail to understand these things which we relate, or, even if they shall understand them, they will dissemble and be unwilling for them to be true. Because they are drawn away by vices, and they knowingly favor their own evils, by the pleasantness of which they are captivated, and they desert the way of virtue, by the bitterness of which they are offended. For they who are inflamed with avarice and a certain insatiable thirst for riches, because, when they have sold or squandered the things in which they delight, they are unable to live in a simple style, undoubtedly prefer that by which they are compelled to renounce their eager desires. Also, they who, urged on by the incitements of lusts, as the poet says, rush into madness and fire, say that we bring forward things plainly and credible, because the precepts about self-restraint wound their ears, which restrain them from their pleasures, to which they have given up their soul, together with their body. But those who, swollen with ambition or inflamed with the love of power, have bestowed all their efforts on the acquisition of honors, will not, even if we should bear the Son himself in our hands, believe that teaching which commands them to despise all power and honor, and to live in humility, and in such humility that they may be able to receive an injury, and if they have received one, be unwilling to return it. These are the men who cry out in any way against the truth with closed eyes. But they who are or shall be of sound mind, that is, not so immersed in vices as to be incurable, will both believe these things, and will readily approach them. And whatever things we say, they will appear to them open, and plain, and simple, and that which is chiefly necessary, true and unassailable. No one favors virtue but he who is able to follow it, but it is not easy for all to follow it. They can do so whom poverty and want have exercised, and made capable of virtue. For if the endurance of evils is virtue, it follows that they are not capable of virtue who have always lived in the enjoyment of good things, because they have never experienced evils, nor can they endure them, through their long-continued use and desire of good things, which alone they know. Thus it comes to pass that the poor and humble, who are unencumbered, more readily believe God than the rich, who are entangled with many hindrances. Yea, rather, in chains and fetters they are enslaved to the knot of desire, their mistress, which has ensnared them with inextricable bonds. Nor are they able to look up to heaven, since their mind is bent down to the earth, and fixed on the ground. But the way of virtue does not admit those carrying great burthens. The path is very narrow by which justice leads man to heaven. No one can keep this unless he is unencumbered and lightly equipped. For those wealthy men, who are loaded with many and great burthens, proceed along the way of death, which is very broad, since destruction rules with extended sway. The precepts which God gives for justice, and the things which we bring forward under the teaching of God respecting virtue and the truth, are bitter and as poisons to these. And if they shall dare to oppose these things, they must own themselves to be enemies of virtue and justice. I will now come to the remaining part of the subject, that an end may be put to the work. But this remains, that we should treat of the judgment of God, which will then be established when our Lord shall return to the earth to render to everyone either a reward or punishment, according to his desert. Therefore, as we spoke in the 4th book concerning his first advent, so in this book we will relate his second advent, which the Jews also both confess and hope for, but in vain, since he must return to the confusion of those for whose call he had before come. For they who impiously treated him with violence in his humiliation, will experience him in his power as a conqueror, and, God requiting them, they will suffer all those things which they read and do not understand, inasmuch as, being polluted with all sins, and moreover sprinkled with the blood of the Holy One, they were devoted to eternal punishment by that very one on whom they laid wicked hands. But we shall have a separate subject against the Jews, in which we shall convict them of error and guilt. Now let us instruct those who are ignorant of the truth. It has been so determined by the arrangement of the Most High God, that this unrighteous age, having run the course of its appointed times, should come to an end, and all wickedness being immediately extinguished, and the souls of the righteous being recalled to a happy life, a quiet, tranquil, peaceful, in short, golden age, as the poets call it, should flourish, under the rule of God himself. This was especially the cause of all the errors of the philosophers, that they did not comprehend the system of the world, which comprises the whole of wisdom. But it cannot be comprehended by our own perception and innate intelligence, which they wished to do by themselves without a teacher. Therefore they fell into various and ofttimes contradictory opinions, out of which they had no way of escape. And they remained fixed in the same mire. As the comic writer says, since their conclusion does not correspond with their assumptions, inasmuch as they had assumed things to be true which could not be affirmed, and proved without the knowledge of the truth and of heavenly things. And this knowledge, as I have often said already, cannot exist in a man unless it is derived from the teaching of God. For if a man is able to understand divine things, he will be able also to perform them, for to understand is, as it were, to follow in their track. But he is not able to do the things which God does, because he is clothed with a mortal body. Therefore he cannot even understand those things which God does. And whether this is possible is easy for everyone to measure, from the immensity of the divine actions and works. For if you will contemplate the world, with all the things which it contains, you will assuredly understand how much the work of God surpasses the works of men. Thus, as great as is the difference between divine and human works, so great must be the distance between the wisdom of God and man. For because God is incorruptible and immortal, and therefore perfect because he is everlasting, his wisdom also is perfect, as he himself is. Nor can anything oppose it, because God himself is subject to nothing. But because man is subject to passion, his wisdom also is subject to error. And as many things hinder the life of man, so that it cannot be perpetual, so also his wisdom must be hindered by many things, so that it is not perfect in entirely perceiving the truth. Therefore there is no human wisdom, if it strives by itself to attain to the conception and knowledge of the truth. Inasmuch as the mind of man, being bound up with a frail body, and enclosed in a dark abode, is neither able to wander at large, nor clearly to perceive the truth, the knowledge of which belongs to the divine nature. For his works are known to God alone. But man cannot attain this knowledge by reflection or disputation, but by learning and hearing from him who alone is able to know and to teach. Therefore Marcus Tullius, borrowing from Plato the sentiment of Socrates, who said that the time had come for himself to depart from life, but that they before whom he was pleading his cause were still alive, says, which is better is known to the immortal gods. But I think that no man knows. Wherefore all the sects of philosophers must be far removed from the truth, because they who established them were men. Nor can those things have any foundation or firmness which are unsupported by any utterances of divine voices. And since we are speaking of the errors of philosophers, the Stoics divide nature into two parts, the one which affects, the other which affords itself tractable for action. They say that in the former is contained all the power of perception, in the latter the material, and that the one cannot act without the other. How can that which handles and that which is handled be one and the same thing? If anyone should say that the potter is the same as the clay, or that the clay is the same as the potter, would he not plainly appear to be mad? But these men comprehend under the one name of nature two things which are most widely different, God and the world, the maker and the work, and say that the one can do nothing without the other, as though God were mixed up in nature with the world. For sometimes they so mix them together, that God himself is the mind of the world, and that the world is the body of God. As though the world and God began to exist at the same time, and God did not himself make the world. And they themselves also confess this at other times, when they say that it was made for the sake of men, and that God could, if he willed it, exist without the world, inasmuch as God is the divine and eternal mind, separate and free from a body. And since they were unable to understand his power and majesty, they mixed him with the world, that is, with his own work. Whence is that saying of Virgil? A spirit whose celestial flame glows in each member of the frame, and stirs the mighty whole. What, then, becomes of their own saying, that the world was both made and is governed by the divine providence? For if he made the world, it follows that he existed without the world. If he governs it, it is plain that it is not as the mind governs the body, but as a master rules the house, as a pilot the ship, as a charioteer the chariot. Nor, however, are they mixed with those things which they govern. For if all these things which we see are members of God, then God is rendered insensible by them, since the members are without sensibility, and mortal, since we see that the members are mortal. I can enumerate how often lands shaken by sudden motions have either opened or sunk down precipitously, how often cities and islands have been overwhelmed by waves, and gone into the deep. Marshes have inundated fruitful plains, rivers and pools have been dried up. Mountains also have either fallen precipitously, or have been leveled with plains. Many districts, and the foundations of many mountains, are laid waste by latent and internal fire. And this is not enough, if God does not spare his own members, unless it is permitted man also to have some power over the body of God. Seas are built up, mountains are cut down, and the innermost bowels of the earth are dug out to draw forth riches. Why, should I say that we cannot even plow without lacerating the divine body? So that we are at once wicked and impious in doing violence to the members of God. Does God, then, suffer his body to be harassed, and endure to weaken himself, or permit this to be done by man? Unless by chance that divine intelligence which is mixed with the world, and with all parts of the world, abandoned the first outer aspect of the earth, and plunged itself into the lowest depths, that it might be sensible of no pain from continual laceration. But if this is trifling and absurd, then they themselves were as devoid of intelligence as those are who have not perceived that the divine spirit is everywhere diffused, and that all things are held together by it, not however in such a manner that God, who is incorruptible, should himself be mixed with heavy and corruptible elements. Therefore that is more correct which they derived from Plato, that the world was made by God, and is also governed by his providence. It was therefore befitting that Plato, and those who held the same opinion, should teach and explain what was the cause, what the reason, for the contriving of so great a work. Why or for the sake of whom he made it. But the Stoics also say the world was made for the sake of men, I hear. But Epicurus is ignorant on what account or who made men themselves. For Lucretius, when he said that the world was not made by the gods, thus spoke. To say, again, that for the sake of men they have willed to set in order the glorious nature of the world. Then he introduced. Is sheer folly. For what advantage can our gratitude bestow on immortal and blessed beings, that for our sake they should take in hand to administer aught? And with good reason, for they brought forward no reason why the human race was created or established by God. It is our business to set forth the mystery of the world and man, of which they, being destitute, were able neither to reach nor see the shrine of truth. Therefore, as I said a little before, when they had assumed that which was true, that is, that the world was made by God, and was made for the sake of men, yet, since their argument failed them in the consequences, they were unable to defend that which they had assumed. In fine, Plato, that he might not make the work of God weak and subject to ruin, said that it would remain forever. If it was made for the sake of men, and so made as to be eternal, why then are not they on whose account it was made eternal? If they are mortal on account of whom it was made, it must also itself be mortal and subject to dissolution, for it is not of more value than those for whose sake it was made. But if his argument were consistent, he would understand that it must perish because it was made, and that nothing can remain forever except that which cannot be touched. But he who says that it was not made for the sake of men has no argument. For if he says that the Creator contrived these works of such magnitude on his own account, why then were we produced? Why do we enjoy the world itself? What means the creation of the human race, and of the other living creatures? Why do we intercept the advantages of others? Why, in short, do we grow, decrease, and perish? What reason is implied in our production itself? What in our perpetual succession? Doubtless God wished us to be seen, and to frame, as it were, impressions with various representations of himself, with which he might delight himself. Nevertheless, if it were so, he would esteem living creatures as his care, and especially man, to whose command he made all things subject. But with regard to those who say that the world always existed, I omit that point, that itself cannot exist without some beginning, from which they are unable to extricate themselves. But I say this, if the world always existed, it can have no systematic arrangement. For what could arrangement have effected in that which never had a beginning? For before anything is done or arranged, there is need of counsel that it may be determined how it should be done, nor can anything be done without the foresight of a settled plan. Therefore the plan precedes every work. Therefore that which has not been made has no plan. But the world has a plan by which it both exists and is governed. Therefore also it was made. If it was made, it will also be destroyed. Let them therefore assign a reason, if they can, why it was either made in the beginning or will hereafter be destroyed. And because Epicurus or Democritus was unable to teach this, he said that it was produced of its own accord, the seeds coming together in all directions, and that when these are again resolved, discord and destruction will follow. Therefore he perverted that which he had correctly seen, and by his ignorance of system entirely overthrew the whole system, and reduced the world, and all things which are done in it, to the likeness of a most trifling dream, if no plan exists in human affairs. But since the world and all its parts, as we see, are governed by a wonderful plan, since the framing of the heaven, and the course of the stars and of the heavenly bodies, which is harmonious even in variety itself, the constant and wonderful arrangement of the seasons, the varied fruitfulness of the lands, the level plains, the defenses and heapings up of mountains, the verdure and productiveness of the woods, the most salubrious bursting forth of fountains, the seasonable overflowings of rivers, the rich and abundant flowing in of the sea, the opposite and useful breathing of the winds, and all things, are fixed with the greatest regularity. Who is so blind as to think that they were made without a cause, in which a wonderful disposition of most provident arrangement shines forth? If, therefore, nothing at all exists nor is done without a cause, if the providence of the supreme God is manifest from the disposition of things, his excellency from their greatness, and his power from their government, therefore they are dull and mad who have said that there is no providence. I should not disapprove if they denied the existence of gods with this object, that they might affirm the existence of one. But when they did it with this intent, that they might say that there is none, he who does not think that they were senseless is himself senseless. But we have spoken sufficiently on the subject of providence in the first book. For if it has any existence, as appears from the wonderful nature of its works, it must be that the same providence created man and the other animals. Let us therefore see what reason there was for the creation of the human race, since it is evident, as the Stoics say, that the world was made for the sake of men, although they make no slight error in this very matter, in saying it was not made for the sake of man, but of men. For the naming of one individual comprehends the whole human race. But this arises from the fact that they are ignorant that one man only was made by God, and they think that men were produced in all lands and fields like mushrooms. But Hermes was not ignorant that man was both made by God and after the likeness of God. But I return to my subject. There is nothing, as I imagine, which was made on its own account. But whatever is made at all must necessarily be made for some purpose. For who is there either so senseless or so unconcerned as to attempt to do anything at random, from which he expects no utility, no advantage? He who builds a house does not build it merely for this purpose, that it may be a house, but that it may be inhabited. He who builds a ship does not bestow his labor on this account, only that the ship may be visible, but that men may sail in it. Likewise he who designs and forms any vessel does not do it on this account, that he may only appear to have done it, but that the vessel when made may contain something necessary for use. In like manner, other things, whatever are made, are plainly not made superfluously, but for some useful purposes. It is plain, therefore, that the world was made by God, not on account of the world itself, for since it is without sensibility, it neither needs the warmth of the sun, or light, or the breath of the winds, or the moisture of showers, or the nourishment of fruits. But it cannot even be said that God made the world for his own sake, since he can exist without the world, as he did before it was made. And God himself does not make use of all those things which are contained in it, and which are produced. It is evident, therefore, that the world was constructed for the sake of living beings, since living beings enjoy those things of which it consists. And that these may live and exist, all things necessary for them are supplied at fixed times. Again, that the other living beings were made for the sake of man, is plain from this, that they are subservient to man, and were given for his protection and service. Since, whether they are of the earth or of the water, they do not perceive the system of the world as man does. We must here reply to the philosophers, and especially to Cicero, who says, "Why should God, when he made all things on our account, make so large a quantity of snakes and vipers? Why should he scatter so many pernicious things by land and by sea?" A very wide subject for discussion, but it must be briefly touched upon, as in passing. Since man is formed of different and opposing elements, soul and body, that is, heaven and earth, that which is slight and that which is perceptible to the senses, that which is eternal and that which is temporal, that which has sensibility and that which is senseless, that which is endued with light and that which is dark. Reason itself and necessity require that both good and evil things should be set before man. Good things which he may use, and evil things which he may guard against and avoid. For wisdom has been given to him on this account, that, knowing the nature of good and evil things, he may exercise the force of his reason in seeking the good and avoiding the evil. For because wisdom was not given to the other animals, they were both defended with natural clothing and were armed. But in the place of all these he gave to man that which was most excellent, reason only. Therefore he formed him naked and unarmed, that wisdom might be both his defense and covering. He placed his defense and ornament not without, but within, not in the body, but in the heart. Unless, therefore, there were evils which he might guard against, and which he might distinguish from good and useful things, wisdom was not necessary for him. Therefore let Marcus Tullius know that reason was either given to man that he might take fishes on account of his own use, and avoid snakes and vipers for the sake of his own safety, or that good and evil things were set before him on this account, because he had received wisdom, the whole force of which is occupied in distinguishing things good and evil. Great, therefore, and right, and admirable is the force, and reason, and power of man, for whose sake God made the world itself and all things, as many as exist, and gave him so much honor that he set him over all things, since he alone could admire the works of God. Most excellently, therefore, does our Asclepiades, in discussing the providence of the supreme God in that book which he wrote to me, say, and on this account anyone may with good reason think that the divine providence gave the place nearest to itself to him who was able to understand its arrangement. For that is the sun. Whoso beholds it is to understand why it is the sun, and what amount of influence it has upon the other parts of the system. This is the heaven, who looks up to it. This is the earth, who inhabits it. This is the sea, who sails upon it. This is fire, who makes use of it. Therefore the supreme God did not arrange these things on account of himself, because he stands in need of nothing, but on account of man, who might fitly make use of them. Let us now assign the reason why he made man himself. For if the philosophers had known this, they would either have maintained those things which they had found to be true, or would not have fallen into the greatest errors. For this is the chief thing. This is the point on which everything turns. And if anyone does not possess this, the truth altogether glides away from him. It is this, in short, which causes them to be inconsistent with reason. For if this had shone upon them, if they had known all the mystery of man, the Academy would never have been in entire opposition to their disputations, and to all philosophy. As, therefore, God did not make the world for his own sake, because he does not stand in need of its advantages, but for the sake of man, who has the use of it, so also he made man himself for his own sake. What advantage is there to God in man, says Epicurus, that he should make him for his own sake? Truly, that there might be one who might understand his works, who might be able both to admire with his understanding, and to express with his voice, the foresight displayed in their arrangement, the order of their creation, the power exerted in their completion. And the sum of all these things is, that he should worship God. For he who understands these things worships him. He follows him with due veneration as the maker of all things. He is his true Father, who measures the excellence of his majesty according to the invention, the commencement, and completion of his works. What more evident argument can be brought forward that God both made the world for the sake of man, and man for his own sake, than that he alone of all living creatures has been so formed that his eyes are directed towards heaven, his face looking towards God, his countenance is in fellowship with his parent, so that God appears, as it were, with outstretched hand to have raised man from the ground, and to have elevated him to the contemplation of himself. What, then, he says, does the worship paid by man confer on God, who is blessed, and in want of nothing? Or if he gave such honor to man as to create the world for his sake, to furnish him with wisdom, to make him lord of all things living, and to love him as a son, why did he make him subject to death and decay? Why did he expose the object of his love to all evils? When it was befitting that man should be happy, as though closely connected with God, and everlasting as he is, to the worship and contemplation of whom he was formed. Although we have taught these things for the most part in a scattered manner in the former books, nevertheless, since the subject now specially requires it, because we have undertaken to discuss the subject of a happy life, these things are to be explained by us more carefully and fully, that the arrangement made by God, and his work and will, may be known. Though he was always able by his own immortal spirit to produce innumerable souls, as he produced the angels, to whom there exists immortality without any danger and fear of evils, yet he devised an unspeakable work, in what manner he might create an infinite multitude of souls, which being at first united with frail and feeble bodies, he might place in the midst between good and evil, that he might set virtue before them composed as they were of both natures, that they might not attain to immortality by a delicate and easy course of life, but might arrive at that unspeakable reward of eternal life with the utmost difficulty and great labors. Therefore, that he might clothe them with limbs which were heavy and liable to injury, since they were unable to exist in the middle void, the weight and gravity of the body sinking downwards, he determined that an abode and dwelling place should first be built for them. And thus with unspeakable energy and power he contrived the surpassing works of the world. And having suspended the light elements on high, and depressed the heavy ones to the depths below, he strengthened the heavenly things, and established the earthly. It is not necessary at present to follow out each point separately, since we discussed them all together in the second book. Therefore he placed in the heaven lights, whose regularity, and brightness, and motion, were most suitably proportioned to the advantage of living beings. Moreover, he gave to the earth, which he designed as their dwelling place, fruitfulness for bringing forth and producing various things, that by the abundance of fruits and green herbs it might supply nourishment according to the nature and requirements of each kind. Then, when he had completed all things which belonged to the condition of the world, he formed man from the earth itself, which he prepared for him from the beginning as a habitation. That is, he clothed and covered his spirit with an earthly body, that, being compacted of different and opposing materials, he might be susceptible of good and evil. And as the earth itself is fruitful for the bringing forth of grain, so the body of man, which was taken from the earth, received the power of producing offspring, that, inasmuch as he was formed of a fragile substance, and could not exist forever, when the space of his temporal life was past, he might depart, and by a perpetual succession renew that which he bore, which was frail and feeble. Why, then, did he make him frail and mortal, when he had built the world for his sake? First of all, that an infinite number of living beings might be produced, and that he might fill all the earth with a multitude. In the next place, that he might set before man virtue, that is, endurance of evils and labors, by which he might be able to gain the reward of immortality. For since man consists of two parts, body and soul, of which the one is earthly, the other heavenly, two lives have been assigned to man. The one temporal, which is appointed for the body, the other everlasting, which belongs to the soul. We received the former at our birth, we attained to the latter by striving, that immortality might not exist to man without any difficulty. That earthly one is as the body, and therefore has an end, but this heavenly one is as the soul, and therefore has no limit. We received the first when we were ignorant of it, this second knowingly, for it is given to virtue, not to nature, because God wished that we should procure life for ourselves in life. For this reason he has given us this present life, that we may either lose that true and eternal life by our vices, or win it by virtue. The chief good is not contained in this bodily life, since, as it was given to us by divine necessity, so it will again be destroyed by divine necessity. Thus that which has an end does not contain the chief good. But the chief good is contained in that spiritual life which we acquire by ourselves, because it cannot contain evil, or have an end, to which subject nature and the system of the body afford an argument. For other animals incline towards the ground, because they are earthly, and are incapable of immortality, which is from heaven. But man is upright and looks towards heaven, because immortality is proposed to him. which, however, does not come, unless it is given to man by God. For otherwise there would be no difference between the just and the unjust, since every man who is born would become immortal. Immortality, then, is not the consequence of nature, but the reward and recompense of virtue. Lastly, man does not immediately upon his birth walk upright, but at first on all fours, because the nature of his body and of this present life is common to us with the dumb animals. Afterwards, when his strength is confirmed, he raises himself, and his tongue is loosened so that he speaks plainly, and he ceases to be a dumb animal. And this argument teaches that man is born mortal, but that he afterwards becomes immortal, when he begins to live in conformity with the will of God, that is, to follow righteousness, which is comprised in the worship of God, since God raised man to a view of the heaven and of himself. And this takes place when man, purified in the heavenly laver, lays aside his infancy together with all the pollution of his past life, and having received an increase of divine vigor, becomes a perfect and complete man. Therefore, because God has set forth virtue before man, although the soul and the body are connected together, yet they are contrary, and oppose one another. The things which are good for the soul are evil to the body, that is, the avoiding of riches, the prohibiting of pleasures, the contempt of pain and death. In like manner, the things which are good for the body are evil to the soul, that is, desire and lust, by which riches are desired, and the enjoyments of various pleasures, by which the soul is weakened and destroyed. Therefore it is necessary, that the just and wise man should be engaged in all evils, since fortitude is victorious over evils. But the unjust in riches, in honors, in power. For these goods relate to the body, and are earthly, and these men also lead an earthly life, nor are they able to attain to immortality, because they have given themselves up to pleasures which are the enemies of virtue. Therefore this temporal life ought to be subject to that eternal life, as the body is to the soul. Whoever, then, prefers the life of the soul must despise the life of the body. Nor will he in any other way be able to strive after that which is highest, unless he shall have despised the things which are lowest. But he who shall have embraced the life of the body, and shall have turned his desires downwards to the earth, is unable to attain to that higher life. But he who prefers to live well for eternity, will live badly for a time, and will be subjected to all troubles and labors as long as he shall be on earth, that he may have divine and heavenly consolation. And he who shall prefer to live well for a time, will live ill to eternity, for he will be condemned by the sentence of God to eternal punishment, because he has preferred earthly to heavenly goods. On this account, therefore, God seeks to be worshipped, and to be honored by man as a father, that he may have virtue and wisdom, which alone produce immortality. For because no other but himself is able to confer that immortality, since he alone possesses it, he will grant to the piety of the man, with which he has honored God, this reward, to be blessed to all eternity, and to be forever in the presence of God and in the society of God. N.B. The following paragraphs to the end of the chapter are wanting many MSS. And it is very doubtful whether they were written by Lactantius. Nor can any one shelter himself under the pretext that the fault belongs to him who made both good and evil. For why did he will that evil should exist if he hated it? Why did he not make good only, that no one might sin, no one commit evil? Although I have explained this in almost all the former books, and have touched upon it, though slightly, above, yet it must be mentioned repeatedly, because the whole matter turns on this point. For there could be no virtue unless he had made contrary things. Nor can the power of good be at all manifest, except from a comparison with evil. Thus evil is nothing else but the explanation of good. Therefore if evil is taken away, good must also be taken away. If you shall cut off your left hand or foot, your body will not be entire, nor will life itself remain the same. Thus, for the due adjustment of the framework of the body, the left members are most suitably joined with the right. In like manner, if you make chessmen all alike, no one will play. If you shall give one color only to the circus, no one will think it worth while to be a spectator, all the pleasure of the Circensian games being taken away. For he who first instituted the games was a favorer of one color, but he introduced another as a rival, that there might be a contest, and some partisanship in the spectacle. Thus God, when he was fixing that which was good, and giving virtue, appointed also their contraries, with which they might contend. If an enemy and a fight be wanting, there is no victory. Take away a contest, and even virtue is nothing. How many are the mutual contests of men, and with what various arts are they carried on? No one, however, would be regarded as surpassing in bravery, swiftness, or excellence, if he bad no adversary with whom he might contend. And where victory is wanting, there also glory and the reward of victory must be absent together with it. Therefore, that he might strengthen virtue itself by continual exercise, and might make it perfect from its conflict with evils, he gave both together, because each of the two without the other is unable to retain its force. Therefore there is diversity, on which the whole system of truth depends. It does not escape my notice what may here be urged in opposition by more skillful persons. If good cannot exist without evil, how do you say that, before he had offended God, the first man lived in the exercise of good only, or that he will hereafter live in the exercise of good only? This question is to be examined by us, for in the former books I omitted it, that I might here fill up the subject. We have said above that the nature of man is made up of opposing elements, for the body, because it is earth, is capable of being grasped, of temporary duration, senseless, and dark. But the soul, because it is from heaven, is unsubstantial, everlasting, endued with sensibility, and full of luster. And because these qualities are opposed to one another, it follows of necessity that man is subject to good and evil. Good is ascribed to the soul, because it is incapable of dissolution. Evil to the body, because it is frail. Since, therefore, the body and the soul are connected and united together, the good and the evil must necessarily hold together. Nor can they be separated from one another, unless when they, the body and soul, are separated. Finally, the knowledge of good and of evil was given at the same time to the first man. And when he understood this, he was immediately driven from the holy place in which there is no evil. For when he was conversant with that which was good only, he was ignorant that this itself was good. But after that he had received the knowledge of good and evil, it was now unlawful for him to remain in that place of happiness, and he was banished to this common world, that he might at once experience both of those things with the nature of which he had at once become acquainted. It is plain, therefore, that wisdom has been given to man that he may distinguish good from evil, that he may discriminate between things advantageous and things disadvantageous, between things useful and things useless, that he may have judgment and consideration as to what he ought to guard against, what to desire, what to avoid, and what to follow. Wisdom therefore cannot exist without evil, and that first author of the human race, as long as he was conversant with good only, lived as an infant, ignorant of good and evil. But, indeed, hereafter man must be both wise and happy without any evil. But this cannot take place as long as the soul is clothed with the abode of the body. But when a separation shall have been made between the body and the soul, then evil will be disunited from good. And as the body perishes and the soul remains, so evil will perish and good be permanent. Then man, having received the garment of immortality, will be wise and free from evil, as God is. He, therefore, who wishes that we should be conversant with good only, especially desires this, that we should live without the body, in which evil is. But if evil is taken away, either wisdom, as I have said, or the body, will be taken from man. Wisdom, that he may be ignorant of evil. The body, that he may not be sensible of it. But now, since man is furnished with wisdom to know, and a body to perceive, God willed that both should exist alike in this life, that virtue and wisdom may be in agreement. Therefore he placed man in the midst, between both, that he might have liberty to follow either good or evil. But he mingled with evil some things which appear good, that is, various and delightful enjoyments, that by the enticements of these he might lead men to the concealed evil. And he likewise mingled with good some things which appear evil, that is, hardships and miseries and labors, by the harshness and unpleasantness of which the soul, being offended, might shrink back from the concealed good. But here the office of wisdom is needed, that we may see more with the mind than with the body, which very few are able to do. Because while virtue is difficult and rarely to be found, pleasure is common and public. Thus it necessarily happens that the wise man is accounted as a fool, who, while he seeks good things which are not seen, permits those which are seen to slip from his hands, and while he avoids evils which are not seen, runs into evils which are before the eyes. Which happens to us when we refuse neither torture nor death in behalf of the faith, since we are driven to the greatest wickedness, so as to betray the faith and deny the true God, and to sacrifice to dead and death-bearing gods. This is the cause why God made man mortal, and made him subject to evils, although he had framed the world for his sake, namely, that he might be capable of virtue, and that his virtue might reward him with immortality. Now virtue, as we have shown, is the worship of the true God. Now let us mark the whole argument by a brief definition. The world has been created for this purpose, that we may be born. We are born for this end, that we may acknowledge the Maker of the world and of ourselves, God. We acknowledge Him for this end, that we may worship Him. We worship Him for this end, that we may receive immortality as the reward of our labors, since the worship of God consists of the greatest labors. For this end we are rewarded with immortality, that being made like to the angels, we may serve the Supreme Father and Lord forever, and may be to all eternity a kingdom to God. This is the sum of all things, this the secret of God, this the mystery of the world, from which they are estranged, who, following present gratification, have devoted themselves to the pursuit of earthly and frail goods, and by means of deadly enjoyments have sunk as it were in mire and mud their souls, which were born for heavenly pursuits. Let us now, in the next place, inquire whether there is anything reasonable in the worship of these gods. For if they are many, if they are worshipped only on this account by men, that they may afford them riches, victories, honors, and all things, which are of no avail except for the present, if we are produced without cause, if no providence is employed in the production of men, if we are brought forth by chance for ourselves, and for the sake of our own pleasure, if we are nothing after death, what can be so superfluous, so empty, so vain, as the affairs of man, and the world itself? Which, though it is of incredible magnitude, and constructed with such wonderful arrangement, is nevertheless occupied with trifling subjects. For why should the breathings of the winds put the clouds in motion? Why should lightnings shine forth, thunders roar, or showers fall, that the earth may bring forth its increase, and nourish its various productions? Why, in short, should all nature labor that nothing may be wanting of those things by which the life of man is sustained, if it is vain, if we utterly perish, if there is in us nothing of greater advantage to God? But if it is unlawful to be spoken, and is not to be thought possible, that which you see to be most in accordance with reason was not established on account of some reason of importance, what reason can there be in these errors of depraved religions, and in this persuasion of philosophers, by which they imagine that souls perish? Assuredly there is none. For what have they to say why the gods so regularly supply to men everything in its season? Is it that we may present to them corn and wine, and the odor of incense, and the blood of cattle? Which things cannot be acceptable to the immortals, because they are perishable. Nor can they be of use to beings destitute of bodies, because these things have been given for the use of those possessed of bodies. And yet if they required these things, they could bestow them upon themselves when they wished. Whether, therefore, souls perish or exist forever, what principle is involved in the worship of the gods, or by whom was the world established? Why, or when, or how long, or how far were men produced, or on what account? Why do they arise, die, succeed one another, or renewed? What do the gods obtain from the worship of those who after death are about to have no existence? What do they perform, what do they promise, what do they threaten, which is worthy of men or of gods? Or if souls remain after death, what do they do or are they about to do respecting them? What need is there to them of a treasure house of souls? From what source do they themselves arise? How, or why, or whence are they so many? Thus it comes to pass, that if you depart from that sum of things which we comprised above, all system is destroyed, and all things return to nothing. And because the philosophers did not comprehend this main point, they were neither able to comprehend truth, although they for the most part both saw and explained those things of which the main point itself consists. But different persons brought forward all these things, and in different ways, not connecting the causes of things, nor the consequences, nor the reasons, so that they might join together and complete that main point which comprises the whole. But it is easy to show that almost the whole truth has been divided by philosophers and sects. For we do not overthrow philosophy, as the academics are accustomed to do, whose plan was to reply to everything, which is rather to calumniate and mock. But we show that no sect was so much out of the way, and no philosopher so vain, as not to see something of the truth. But while they are mad with the desire of contradicting, while they defend their own arguments even though false, and overthrow those of others even though true, not only has the truth escaped from them, which they pretended that they were seeking, but they themselves lost it chiefly through their own fault. But if there had been anyone to collect together the truth which was dispersed amongst individuals and scattered amongst sects, and to reduce it to a body, he assuredly would not disagree with us. But no one is able to do this, unless he has experience and knowledge of the truth. But to know the truth belongs to him only who has been taught by God. For he cannot in any other way reject the things which are false, or choose and approve of those which are true. But if even by chance he should effect this, he would most surely act the part of the philosopher. And though he could not defend those things by divine testimonies, yet the truth would explain itself by its own light. Wherefore the error of those is incredible, who, when they have approved of any sect, and have devoted themselves to it, condemn all others as false and vain, and arm themselves for battle, neither knowing what they ought to defend nor what to refute, and make attacks everywhere, without distinction, upon all things which are brought forward by those who disagree with them. On account of these most obstinate contentions of theirs, no philosophy existed which made a nearer approach to the truth, for the whole truth has been comprised by these in separate portions. Plato said that the world was made by God. The prophets speak the same, and the same is apparent from the verses of the Sibyl. They therefore are in error, who have said either that all things were produced of their own accord or from an assemblage of atoms. Since so great a world, so adorned and of such magnitude, could neither have been made nor arranged and set in order without some most skillful author, and that very arrangement by which all things are perceived to be kept together and to be governed bespeaks an artificer with a most skillful mind. The Stoics say that the world, and all things which are in it, were made for the sake of men. The sacred writings teach us the same thing. Therefore Democritus was in error, who thought that they were poured forth from the earth like worms, without any author or plan. For the reason of man's creation belongs to a divine mystery, and because he was unable to know this, he drew down man's life to nothing. Aristo asserted that men were born to the exercise of virtue. We are also reminded of and learn the same from the prophets. Therefore Aristippus is deceived, who made man subject to pleasure, that is, to evil, as though he were a beast. Pharisaids and Plato contended that souls were immortal. But this is a peculiar doctrine in our religion. Therefore Dicaearchus was mistaken, together with Democritus, who argued that souls perished with the body and were dissolved. Zeno the Stoic taught that there were infernal regions, and that the abodes of the good were separated from the wicked, and that the former enjoyed peaceful and delightful regions, but that the latter suffered punishment in dark places, and in dreadful abysses of mire. The prophets show the same thing. Therefore Epicurus was mistaken, who thought that that was an invention of the poets, and explained those punishments of the infernal regions, which are spoken of, as happening in this life. Therefore the philosophers touched upon the whole truth, and every secret of our holy religion. But when others denied it, they were unable to defend that which they had found, because the system did not agree with the particulars. Nor were they able to reduce to a summary those things which they had perceived to be true, as we have done above. The one chief good, therefore, is immortality, for the reception of which we were originally formed and born. To this we direct our course. Human nature regards this, to this virtue exalts us. And because we have discovered this good, it remains that we should also speak of immortality itself. The arguments of Plato, although they contribute much to the subject, have little strength to prove and fill up the truth, since he had neither summed up and collected into one the plan of the whole of this great mystery, nor had he comprehended the chief good. For although he perceived the truth respecting the immortality of the soul, yet he did not speak respecting it as though it were the chief good. We, therefore, are able to elicit the truth by more certain signs, for we have not collected it by doubtful surmise, but have known it by divine instruction. Now Plato thus reasoned, that whatever has perception by itself, and always moves, is immortal. For that which has no beginning of motion is not about to have an end, because it cannot be deserted by itself. But this argument would give eternal existence even to dumb animals, unless he had made a distinction by the addition of wisdom. He added, therefore, that he might escape this common linking together, that the soul of man could not be otherwise than immortal, since its wonderful skill in invention, its quickness in reflection, and its readiness in perceiving and learning, its memory of the past, and its foresight of the future, and its knowledge of innumerable arts and subjects, which other living creatures do not possess, appear divine and heavenly, because of the soul, which conceives such great things, and contains such great things. No origin can be found on earth, since it has nothing of earthly admixture united with it. But that which is ponderous in man, and liable to dissolution, must be resolved into earth. Whereas that which is slight and subtle is incapable of division, and when freed from the abode of the body, as from prison, it flies to the heaven, and to its own nature. This is a brief summary of the tenets of Plato, which are widely and copiously explained in his own writings. Pythagoras also was previously of the same sentiments, and his teacher Pherecydes, whom Cicero reported to have been the first who discoursed respecting the immortality of the soul. And although all these excelled in eloquence, nevertheless in this contest at least, those who argued against this opinion had no less authority. Dicaearchus first, then Democritus, and lastly Epicurus. So that the matter itself, respecting which they were contending, was called into doubt. Finally, Tullius, also having set forth the opinions of all these respecting immortality and death, declared that he did not know what was the truth. Which of these opinions is true, he said, some God may see. And again he says in another place, since each of these opinions had most learned defenders, it cannot be divined what is certainty. But we have no need of divination, since the divinity itself has laid open to us the truth. By these arguments, therefore, which neither Plato nor any other invented, the immorality of souls can be proved and perceived. Which arguments we will briefly collect, since my discourse hastens on to relate the great judgment of God, which will be celebrated on the earth at the approaching end of the world. Before all things, since God cannot be seen by man, lest anyone should imagine from this circumstance that God does not exist, because he was not seen by mortal eyes, among other wonderful arrangements. He also made many things the power of which is manifest, but the substance is not seen, as the voice, smell, the wind, that by the token and example of these things we might perceive God from his power and operation and works, although he did not fall under the notice of our eyes. What is clearer than the voice, or stronger than the wind, or more forcible than smell? Yet these, when they are borne through the air and come to our senses, and impel them by their efficacy, are not distinguished by the eyesight, but are perceived by other parts of the body. In like manner, God is not to be perceived by us through the sight or other frail sense, but he is to be beheld by the eyes of the mind, since we see his illustrious and wonderful works. For as to those who have altogether denied the existence of God, I should not only refuse to call them philosophers, but even deny them the name of men, who, with a close resemblance to dumb animals, consisted of body only, discerning nothing with their mind, and referring all things to the bodily senses, who thought that nothing existed but that which they beheld with their eyes. And because they saw that adversity befell the wicked, or prosperity happened to the good, they believed that all things were carried on by fortune, and that the world was established by nature, and not by providence. Hence they at once fell into the absurdities which necessarily followed such a sentiment. But if there is a God who is incorporeal, invisible, and eternal, therefore it is credible that the soul, since it is not seen, does not perish after its departure from the body. For it is manifest that something exists which perceives and is vigorous, and yet does not come into sight. But, it is said, it is difficult to comprehend with the mind how the soul can retain its perception without those parts of the body in which the office of perception is contained. What about God? Is it easy to comprehend how he is vigorous without a body? But if they believe in the existence of gods who, if they exist, are plainly destitute of bodies, it must be that human souls exist in the same way, since it is perceived from reason itself, and discernment, that there is a certain resemblance in man and God. Finally, that proof which even Marcus Tullius saw is of sufficient strength, that the immortality of the soul may be discerned from the fact that there is no other animal which has any knowledge of God. And religion is almost the only thing which distinguishes man from the dumb creation. And since this falls to man alone, it assuredly testifies that we may aim at, desire, and cultivate that which is about to be familiar and very near. Can anyone, when he has considered the nature of other animals, which the providence of the supreme God has made abject, with bodies bending down and prostrated to the earth, so that it may be understood from this that they have no intercourse with heaven, fail to understand that man alone of all animals is heavenly and divine, whose body raised from the ground, elevated countenance, and upright position, goes in quest of its origin, and despising, as it were, the lowliness of the earth, reaches forth to that which is on high, because he perceives that the highest good is to be sought by him in the highest place, and mindful of his condition in which God made him illustrious, looks towards his Maker. And Trismegistus most rightly called this looking a contemplation of God, which has no existence in the dumb animals. Since therefore wisdom, which is given to man alone, is nothing else but the knowledge of God, it is evident that the soul does not perish, nor undergo dissolution, but that it remains forever, because it seeks after and loves God, who is everlasting, by the impulse of its very nature perceiving either from what source it has sprung, or to what it is about to return. Moreover, it is no slight proof of immortality that man alone makes use of the heavenly element. For, since the nature of the world consists of two elements which are opposed to one another, fire and water, of which the one is assigned to the heaven, the other to the earth, the other living creatures, because they are of the earth and mortal, make use of the element which is earthly and heavy. Man alone makes use of fire, which is an element light, rising upward, and heavenly. But those things which are weighty depress to death, and those which are light elevate to life, because life is on high, and death below. And as there cannot be light without fire, so there cannot be life without light. Therefore fire is the element of light and life, from which it is evident that man who uses it is a partaker of an immortal condition, because that which causes life is familiar to him. The gift of virtue also to man alone is a great proof that souls are immortal. For this will not be in accordance with nature if the soul is extinguished, for it is injurious to this present life. For that earthly life, which we lead in common with dumb animals, both seeks pleasure by the varied and agreeable fruits of which it is delighted, and avoids pain, the harshness of which, by its unpleasant sensations, injures the nature of living beings, and endeavors to lead them to death, which dissolves the living being. If, therefore, virtue both prohibits man from those goods which are naturally desired, and impels him to endure evils which are naturally avoided, it follows that virtue is an evil, and opposed to nature. And he must necessarily be judged foolish who pursues it, since he injures himself both by avoiding present goods, and by seeking equally evils, without hope of greater advantage. For when it is permitted us to enjoy the sweetest pleasures, should we not appear to be without sense if we should not prefer to live in lowliness, in want, in contempt and ignominy, or not to live at all, but to be tormented with pain, and to die, when from these evils we should gain nothing to compensate us for the pleasure which we have given up? But if virtue is not an evil, and acts honorably, inasmuch as it despises vicious and shameful pleasures, and bravely, inasmuch as it neither fears pain nor death, that it may discharge its duty, therefore it must obtain some greater good than those things are which it despises. But when death has been undergone, what further good can be hoped for except immortality?
Thanks for listening to this episode of A Setting of Silver. The audio you've been listening to was produced by Bill Connick using Google's text-to-speech service. The text was taken from an 1885 collection of early church writings available at ccel.org. Finally, I want to thank the volunteers at CCEL who organized and formatted the data into a computer-friendly format. Without their work, this would have been practically impossible to create.